let's moving to the next speaker is Jean-Pierre Bienaimé, my friend from UMTS Forum.
Long time ago.
Long time ago, yeah.
Thank you, Francisco. So, just the first slide, and let's go to the second one. As it was said earlier, and particularly this morning, at the regulatory governmental panel, early access to spectrum is key, and it's very important to make spectrum available early. For high data rate, we said 5G PPP, 5G spectrum group, as early as last year in the Oulu conference, that it's important that large enough contiguous bandwidth be available from a minimum of 100 megahertz to 500 for higher bands, dependent on carrier frequency. This is well known. We have, of course, totally supported the RSPG European pioneer frequency bands, the 26 for hotspot data speeds, the 3.5 for urban mobile data speeds, and the 700, which is very important, for reliable coverage, but also for indoor coverage. Let's mention the very recent response to the RSPG opinions from the 5GIA spectrum work group. First one being on a specific point, more technical point of this second opinion that is now from a certain time closed, but we used the involvement of our 5G PPP projects to give some technical to lead some technical surveys and give technical advice on questions that were asked. How could we improve spectrum sharing, notably between 5G and other services? The recent work group spectrum was that two features, millimeter wave bands radio access and antenna beamforming technologies, were confirmed as suggested by the RSPG opinion as the two main 5G features as technical enablers of new ways of spectrum sharing by minimizing the interferences and radiations between 5G stations and other users, enabling to locate closer those 5G stations. And there are still some domains to be deepened, such as the let's say combination of these antenna beamforming with also database and geolocation. The second recent response to RSPG opinion from our 5GIA work group is on the two questions from RSPG: defragmentation, interest of defragmentation of the 3.4, 3.8 gigahertz frequency band on the one hand, and on the other hand, which is a relatively new topic, ensure connectivity for vertical industries with potentially dedicated private spectrum. The response of the group was that on the first question, of course, spectrum award processes should consider effective and efficient mechanisms to ensure the widest contiguous blocks of spectrum be made available. We consider that there are still too much fragmentation in the 3.4, 3.8 gigahertz, and it's of course also the case on the 700. It was said this morning by Philippe Lefebvre that we had 9 countries having assigned the 3.5 spectrum. It's not bad, but it's not enough, and it's still less for the 700. So it's very important to defragmentate. Second, regulation should support flexibility to allow for cooperative models. So we are more on a sort of combination between the spectrum, classical spectrum to mobile network operators, combined with serving the local private verticals by the MNOs using the network slicing facility in order to better respond to the needs of the private verticals without, at this stage, without necessarily advocate immediately for a dedicated spectrum. So this is our beginning position. Then there are many discussions at the European level preparing the next framework program 2021-2027. This is called now Horizon Europe. After Horizon 2020, it's Horizon Europe. And the Spectrum Group will study, these are some paths, some orientations, but it's not final, of course, to examine technical issues related to 5G spectrum for verticals, of course, to go on in this aspect. This is today more a regulatory political issue to give or not to give dedicated spectrum, or if we give spectrum to the vertical industries, will it be adjacent to mobile network operator spectrum or not adjacent, for instance? And depending on regulatory decisions, technical issues to address, such as interferences. Then technologies and architectures to support the spectrum sharing regime. Spectrum sharing, it was said this morning, so very important. So such as light licensing in the 3.5 in urban areas for spectrum sharing. Neutral hosts, we have already some 5G PPP project, 5G Monarch, for instance, that developed the neutral host. Road and rail corridors, and also dynamic spectrum access in order to optimize the use of potentially unused spectrum, unused 5G spectrum, priority being given to the licensee, and if there are possibilities to give to other users in order to optimize the unused spectrum. And finally, frequency bands and solutions for indoor coverage with millimeter wave frequency bands. So besides the High Pioneer 26, it's important in the framework of the WRC 19 to conduct the support studies of all bands suggested, such as 32 gigahertz, 42 gigahertz for Europe. Indoors low power use, it was already said by our spectrum group in Oulu last year. Outdoor to indoor coverage cannot be relied totally upon the 3.6 or the 26. Large parts of the population live outside and not being necessarily covered by those bands in very good conditions. So 5G indoor private use can help fill this gap, and a high volume indoor 5G cell market will help reduce. And finally, to finish, predictable spectrum management is important. Stable and predictable regulatory environments are critically important. Exclusive mobile license spectrum assignments remain important, but we are of course quite open on new solutions, unlicensed, sharing, coexistence, and studies on new bands, particularly higher bands, must carefully assess other existing and planned services in this band. Thank you for your attention.